The gunshot that echoed through the dusty streets of Telluride, Colorado on that sweltering July afternoon in 1882, was not what changed Quincy Walker's life, though he would remember the sharp crack of it for years to come. What changed everything was the scream that followed, a woman's voice full of terror and rage, and the way his horse had stopped dead in its tracks as if sensing his sudden need to turn around. Quincy had been riding through town with every intention of passing straight through without stopping. He had supplies enough for another week on the trail, and Telluride held nothing for him but memories he would rather forget. 3 years ago, he had buried his brother in the cemetery on the hill overlooking this mining town, and he had sworn never to return. Yet here he was, and now here he was turning his horse toward trouble he had no business getting involved in. The screaming came from the Rose Garden, which was not a garden at all but the largest brothel in Telluride, a 3-story building painted an incongruous pink that stood out against the rough lumber and stone of the surrounding structures. Quincy had never set foot inside, though plenty of miners and cowboys frequented the place. He kept his distance from such establishments, not out of moral superiority, but out of a bone-deep loneliness that he knew would only deepen in rooms where affection was bought and sold. He dismounted and tied his horse to the rail outside, his boots hitting the wooden boardwalk with heavy thuds. 2 men stumbled out the door, laughing about something, and barely glanced at him as they passed. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and cheap perfume. A piano played somewhere in the back, tinny and out of tune. Several women in various states of undress lounged on velvet furniture that had seen better days, and they looked at him with practiced interest that died when they saw his face. Quincy had been told he had the kind of expression that warned people away, all hard angles and gray eyes that had seen too much. "Help you with something, cowboy." The madam who approached him was a large woman with rouge-painted cheeks and a dress that was trying very hard to be elegant. She looked him up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who made her living reading men. "Heard screaming," Quincy said, his voice rough from disuse. He spent most of his days alone on the range, and conversation had become a foreign thing. Nothing to concern yourself with. Just a girl who does not understand her place. The madam's smile was cold. "Now, if you are looking for company, I have several lovely ladies who would be happy to." Another scream cut through her words, and this time Quincy heard the distinct sound of flesh hitting flesh. His jaw tightened. The madam's expression hardened. "I said it is nothing to concern yourself with. I suggest you leave." Quincy did not leave. Instead, he walked past the madam, ignoring her outraged squawk, and headed toward the stairs. A large man who had been sitting in the corner stood up, his hand going to the gun at his hip, but Quincy was faster. He had his revolver out and pointed at the man before the bouncer could clear his holster. "Do not," Quincy said quietly. The bouncer froze. "You are making a terrible mistake," the madam hissed behind him. "Do you have any idea who owns this establishment? Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you are bringing on yourself?" Quincy did not answer. He was already climbing the stairs, his gun still drawn, following the sound of sobbing that came from somewhere on the 2nd floor. Behind him, he could hear the madam ordering someone to fetch the sheriff, but he did not care. Something had taken hold of him, something he could not name, a compulsion that overrode common sense and self-preservation. The hallway upstairs was narrow and dark, with doors lining both sides. Most were closed, but one stood ajar, and from inside came the sound of a man's voice, low and threatening. Quincy approached and pushed the door open with his boot. The room was small and shabby, with a bed that took up most of the space and a washstand in the corner. A man in an expensive suit stood over a woman who was crouched on the floor, her arms raised to protect her head. Blood trickled from her nose, and her dress was torn at the shoulder. The man held a walking stick raised as if to strike again. "Get away from her," Quincy said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The man spun around, his face flushed with anger and drink. "This is none of your concern. I paid for her, and I will do as I please." "Not anymore, you will not." The man looked at the gun in Quincy's hand and seemed to recalculate his position. He was not so drunk that he could not recognize danger when it was pointed at him. "You know who I am. I am Harold Thornton. I own half the silver mines in this district. I will have you thrown in jail, or better yet, I will have you shot." "You can try," Quincy said. "But right now, you are going to leave this room in this building, and you are not going to come back." Harold Thornton's face turned an alarming shade of purple. For a moment, Quincy thought the man might actually be stupid enough to charge at him, but then Thornton threw down his walking stick with a clatter and stormed toward the door. "This is not over," he spat as he passed. "Not by a long shot." Quincy waited until the man's footsteps had faded down the stairs before he holstered his gun and turned to the woman on the floor. She was staring at him with wide eyes, her whole body trembling. Now that he could see her properly, he realized she was young, probably not more than 22 or 23, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and hung around her face in tangled waves. Despite the blood and the fear, there was something striking about her, a defiance in the set of her jaw that had not been beaten out of her yet. "Can you stand?" Quincy asked, offering his hand. She looked at his hand as if it might be a trick, then slowly reached up and took it. Her fingers were cold and slim, and he could feel them shaking as he helped her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Thank you," she whispered, then winced and touched her nose gingerly. "We need to get you out of here," Quincy said. He could hear heavy footsteps on the stairs, multiple sets, and he knew his time was running out. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though she looked uncertain. Quincy glanced around the room and saw a carpet bag in the corner. "Is that yours?" "Yes." But he grabbed the bag and handed it to her, then guided her toward the door. In the hallway, they nearly collided with the madam and three men, one of whom wore a sheriff's badge. The sheriff was a thin man with a drooping mustache and eyes that looked perpetually tired. "This the one causing trouble, Martha?" the sheriff asked the madam. "That is him, Sheriff Daniels. He pulled a gun on my staff and threatened one of my best customers." "That's so." Sheriff Daniels looked at Quincy without much interest. "You know it is illegal to draw a weapon in a public establishment." "I know it is illegal to assault a woman, paying customer or not," Quincy replied evenly. The sheriff's gaze shifted to the woman at Quincy's side, taking in her bloodied face and torn dress. Something flickered in his expression, but it was gone too quickly to read. "Miss Olivia here is employed at this establishment. What happens between her and her customers is a private business matter. Not when it involves battery." "Now listen here," the sheriff said, his voice taking on an edge of annoyance. "I do not know who you think you are, but you cannot just walk into a respectable business and respectable," Quincy repeated, and there was something dangerous in the way he said it. His hand had drifted back toward his gun, not quite touching it but close enough to make his intent clear. The sheriff noticed and stiffened. The three men behind him shifted nervously. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Olivia spoke, her voice stronger than Quincy would have expected. "I want to leave," she said. "I am tired of this life and I want to leave." "You signed a contract, girl," the madam snapped. "You owe me 6 more months of work plus what you owe for room and board. You are not going anywhere until that debt is paid." "How much?" Quincy heard himself ask. Everyone looked at him in surprise, including Olivia. "What?" the madam said. "How much does she owe you? I will pay it." The madam's eyes narrowed with calculation. $200. It was an outrageous sum, probably twice what Olivia actually owed, but Quincy did not argue. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the roll of bills he kept there. Money he had saved from 3 years of working cattle drives and odd jobs across Colorado and Wyoming. He counted out $200 and held it out. "Her debt is paid. She is free to go." The madam snatched the money and counted it twice, her lips moving silently. When she was satisfied, she shoved it into her bodice and stepped back. "Fine. She is your problem now, but she does not get to take anything that belongs to the house." "The clothes on my back are mine," Olivia said quietly. "And the bag has my personal belongings. Nothing in there belongs to you." The madam looked as if she wanted to argue, but Quincy took a step forward and she thought better of it. Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat. "I suppose there is no crime here then, if the debt is paid. You two should probably move along before Mr. Thornton decides to make more trouble." Quincy did not need to be told twice. He kept his hand on Olivia's elbow and guided her past the group, down the stairs, and through the main parlor where several women watched in silence. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding after the dim interior, and the heat hit them like a physical force. Quincy's horse stood waiting at the rail, patient as always. "Can you ride?" Quincy asked. Olivia nodded. He helped her up into the saddle, then tied her carpet bag to his bedroll and swung up behind her. She stiffened at the proximity, and he tried to give her as much space as possible while still being able to hold the reins. He turned the horse and rode away from the rose garden, away from the center of town, toward the outskirts where the buildings grew sparse and the road turned to dirt. They rode in silence for nearly 20 minutes before Olivia finally spoke. "Where are we going?" It was a fair question, and Quincy realized he had no good answer. He had not thought beyond getting her out of that place. Now, sitting here with this woman he did not know, having just spent most of his savings to buy her freedom, he was beginning to wonder if he had lost his mind. "There is a boarding house on the edge of town," he said finally. "Run by a widow named Mrs. Chen. She is a good woman. You can stay there while you figure out what you want to do next. I have no money to pay for a boarding house. I will take care of it." Olivia twisted in the saddle to look at him, and for the first time he got a good look at her eyes. They were green, the color of new leaves, and they were searching his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why did you do all this? Why did you pay my debt? Why are you helping me? You do not know me. I could be anyone. I could be trouble." Quincy looked away, unable to hold her gaze. It was a question he had been asking himself since the moment he climbed those stairs. Why had he done it? He had spent 3 years deliberately avoiding connection, avoiding caring about anything or anyone. He had made himself into a ghost, drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to matter. And yet something about her scream had cut through all his carefully constructed walls. "My mother," he said finally, the words coming out rough and reluctant, "worked in a place like that. In Kansas when I was young. She hated every day of it, but she had no choice. My father had died and she had 2 boys to feed. She got sick when I was 12. Lung sickness. She died in that place, in a room not much different from the one I found you in." He felt Olivia's sharp intake of breath, felt the way her body went very still. "I was too young to help her," Quincy continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Too young to do anything but watch her fade away. Every time I heard you scream, I heard her. All those times she must have been scared or hurt, and I could not help her. So I guess I was not really saving you. I was trying to save her, even though it is 20 years too late." The silence that followed was profound. Quincy could hear the horses' hooves on the packed dirt, the distant sound of hammering from the mines, the wind moving through the scrub brush that lined the road. He could feel Olivia trembling in front of him, and when he glanced down, he saw tears streaming down her face, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "I am sorry," he said awkwardly. "I did not mean to upset you." "No," Olivia said, her voice thick with emotion. "No, you do not understand. In that place, men came every day, dozens of them, and not one of them ever looked at me and saw a person. They saw something to use, something to own for an hour or a night. They saw whatever they wanted to see, but you looked at me and saw your mother. You saw someone worth saving." She turned in the saddle again, and this time when their eyes met, something passed between them that Quincy could not name. It was not attraction, not exactly, though he was aware of her in a way that made his heart beat faster. It was more like recognition, as if they had both been wandering in the dark and had suddenly found someone who understood what that darkness felt like. "My name is Olivia Anderson," she said softly, "and I do not know how to thank you for what you did." "Quincy Walker," he replied. "And you do not need to thank me. Just live a good life, whatever that means to you. That will be thanks enough." Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a modest two-story structure at the very edge of Telluride, with a vegetable garden in front and chickens pecking in the yard. Mrs. Chen herself was a small Chinese woman in her 50s, with silver threading through her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Olivia's battered face and ushered her inside without asking questions, chattering in a mix of English and Cantonese about hot water and clean clothes and soup. Quincy stood in the doorway, suddenly feeling out of place. Mrs. Chen turned to him and switched to English. "You wait in parlor. I take care of her, then we talk about payment." He did as he was told, settling into a worn armchair in a room that was clean and sparse but comfortable. Through the thin walls, he could hear Mrs. Chen moving around upstairs, her voice a soothing murmur. Quincy leaned his head back and closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him now that the crisis had passed. What had he done? He had blown most of his savings on a stranger, made enemies of both a powerful mine owner and the town's biggest brothel, and gotten himself tangled up in exactly the kind of situation he had been avoiding for years. He should get up, pay Mrs. Chen for a week's lodging, and ride out of Telluride before things got any worse. He should go back to the life he knew, the solitary existence that was safe and predictable and empty. But when he opened his eyes and saw Olivia coming down the stairs an hour later, her face scrubbed clean and wearing a simple blue dress that Mrs. Chen must have lent her, he knew he was not going anywhere. Mrs. Chen had tended to Olivia's injuries, and though her nose was swollen and a bruise was darkening her left cheek, she looked better. More importantly, she looked calmer, as if the hot water and clean clothes had washed away some of the fear. She saw him and hesitated on the bottom step. "Mrs. Chen says you are paying for a week's lodging," she said. "That is right. I cannot let you do that. You have already spent too much on me." "It is done," Quincy said, standing up. "Besides, you need time to heal and to figure out your next move. A week should give you that." Olivia descended the last step and crossed the room to stand in front of him. She was not tall, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, but she held herself with a dignity that made her seem taller. "I will pay you back," she said firmly. "Every cent. I do not know how or when, but I will." "That is not necessary." "It is to me." Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "You argue about money later. Now, girl needs rest and you need to leave so she can have it. You come back tomorrow, check on her. We see where things stand then." Quincy nodded. He looked at Olivia one more time, trying to think of something to say, but no words came. So he simply tipped his hat to both women and left. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Quincy untied his horse and stood there for a moment, his hand on the animal's neck, trying to figure out what he was feeling. For 3 years, he had been numb, going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. Now, suddenly, he felt everything. Anxiety about what he had set in motion. Worry about whether Olivia would be safe. And underneath it all, something he refused to examine too closely, a warmth in his chest when he thought about the way she had looked at him. He rode to the stable at the center of town and arranged to board his horse for a few days, then found a cheap hotel and paid for a room. The hotel was shabby and the bed was hard, but he had slept in worse places. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Telluride at night, the saloon spilling music and laughter into the streets, the occasional gunshot, the rattle of wagons. When he finally slept, he dreamed of his mother for the first time in years. The next morning, Quincy woke early and found a diner that served breakfast. Over eggs and bitter coffee, he tried to make a plan. The smart thing would be to check on Olivia, make sure she was settled, and then leave town. He had enough money left to get by for a while, and there was always work for a man who was not afraid of hard labor. He could head north to Wyoming, or west to Utah, or even back down to New Mexico. The world was full of places where a man could disappear. But when he finished his breakfast and walked out into the morning sun, his feet carried him toward Mrs. Chen's boarding house. Mrs. Chen answered his knock, took one look at him, and shook her head with what might have been amusement. "She is in garden, helping with vegetables. You go around back." He found Olivia kneeling in the dirt between rows of tomato plants, pulling weeds and placing them in a basket beside her. She wore the same blue dress from yesterday and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her face from the sun. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and something in her expression made his heart skip. "Good morning," she said, sitting back on her heels. "I did not expect to see you so soon." "Wanted to make sure you were all right," Quincy said, feeling awkward. He was not good at this, at talking to people, at pretending he knew what he was doing. "I am well, considering. Mrs. Chen has been very kind." Olivia paused, then added, "She says you paid for 2 weeks, not one." Quincy shrugged. "You might need more time." "You need to stop spending money on me." "I will spend my money how I see fit." Olivia stood up, brushing dirt from her skirt. The bruise on her face had darkened to a deep purple, and her nose was still swollen, but her eyes were clear and direct. "Why are you still here, Mr. Walker?" "You saved me. You found me a safe place to stay. You have done more than anyone could expect. Why have you not moved on?" It was the same question Quincy had been asking himself all night. He did not have a good answer, or at least not one he was ready to say out loud. So instead, he said, "Have you thought about what you are going to do after the 2 weeks?" "I am not sure," Olivia admitted. "I have been thinking about it. Mrs. Chen says there might be work in town, maybe in one of the restaurants or hotels. Respectable work. I can cook and clean and sew. I could make an honest living." "Telluride is a small town," Quincy said carefully. "People talk. Once they know where you came from, they might not be willing to give you a chance." Olivia's expression hardened. "Then I will go somewhere else. I am not afraid of starting over." "I am not saying you should be. I am just saying it might not be as easy as you think." "Nothing in my life has been easy, Mr. Walker. I do not expect that to change now." They stood there in the garden, the morning sun warming the air, the smell of tomato plants sharp and green around them. Quincy wanted to say something, to offer some kind of reassurance, but the words would not come. He was not good at this. He had spent too long alone. "Would you like to take a walk?" Olivia asked suddenly. I have been cooped up in the house since yesterday and I could use some fresh air. Mrs. Chen says there is a nice trail up the hill behind the boarding house. Quincy hesitated, then nodded. All right. The trail was narrow and steep, winding up through scrub oak and pine trees that grew more dense as they climbed. Olivia led the way, moving with a sureness that surprised him. For someone who had spent recent years in a brothel, she seemed comfortable in the wilderness. He mentioned this, and she glanced back at him with a small smile. I grew up on a farm in Missouri, she said. My father raised horses, and I spent most of my childhood outdoors. I can ride and shoot and track as well as any man. How did you end up in Telluride? The smile faded. The usual story, I suppose. My parents died of fever when I was 17. The bank took the farm. I had an aunt in Denver who said she would take me in, so I used what little money I had to buy a stagecoach ticket west. But when I got to Denver, I found out my aunt had died 6 months earlier. I was alone in a strange city with no money and no prospects. She paused on the trail, her back to him, and he could see the tension in her shoulders. I tried to find work, she continued. I really did, but nobody wanted to hire a young woman with no references and no family. I ran out of money for lodging. I slept in alleys. I went days without eating. And then one day, a woman found me and offered me a warm bed and 3 meals a day. All I had to do was work for her. I was so hungry, so tired that I said yes before I really understood what kind of work she meant. The contract, Quincy said quietly. Yes. By the time I realized what I had agreed to, it was too late. I owed her for the clothes she had given me, the meals, the room. The debt kept growing no matter how much I worked. I tried to leave once 2 years ago. They caught me before I made it out of Denver. The man who owned the brothel beat me so badly I could not walk for a week. After that, I stopped trying. I just went through the motions day after day until I stopped feeling like a person at all. She turned to look at him, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was not crying. The tears just sat there, suspended, as if she had forgotten how to let them fall. When Mrs. Chen sent me to Telluride 8 months ago, I thought maybe things would be different, but they were not. Same life, different building. And then yesterday that man came in and he was so drunk, so violent. I fought back for the first time in 2 years. I did not care if they beat me or killed me. I was just so tired of being afraid. Quincy did not think. He just stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. She stiffened for a moment and he almost let go, afraid he had misread the situation. But then she collapsed against him, her face pressed into his shirt, and she finally cried. He held her while she sobbed, his hand moving awkwardly over her back, not sure what else to do. He could feel her pain as if it were his own, and it cracked something open inside him that he had kept locked away for years. All the grief he had never allowed himself to feel for his mother, all the loneliness of his wandering years, all the shame of not being able to save the one person who had mattered most, it all came pouring out. When Olivia's tears finally subsided, she pulled back and looked up at him. I am sorry, she said, wiping her eyes. I did not mean to fall apart like that. You have nothing to be sorry for, Quincy said, and he meant it. You have been through more than anyone should have to endure. So have you, she said softly. I can see it in your eyes. You carry your own pain. They stood there on the hillside, the wind moving through the trees above them, and Quincy realized that something had shifted between them. They were no longer strangers. They were two broken people who had found each other in the wreckage, and there was a connection forming that scared him more than any gunfight ever had. Over the next week, Quincy found himself spending more and more time at Mrs. Chen's boarding house. He told himself he was just checking on Olivia, making sure she was all right, but the truth was that he looked forward to seeing her. They took walks together in the evenings when the heat had broken. They sat on the porch and talked about everything and nothing. Olivia told him about her childhood on the farm, about her father teaching her to ride before she could walk, about her mother's garden that always smelled like lavender. Quincy found himself sharing memories he had not spoken of in years: his brother who had been killed in a mining accident, the cattle drives he had worked, the vast emptiness of the Wyoming plains. Mrs. Chen watched them with knowing eyes but said nothing. She seemed to approve in her quiet way, always making sure there was fresh lemonade on the porch and finding reasons to leave them alone. On the 8th day, Quincy was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood while Olivia read aloud from a newspaper. Mrs. Chen had brought home from town when a rider approached. It was Sheriff Daniels, and the expression on his face was grim. "Mr. Walker," the sheriff said, dismounting, "I need to have a word with you." Quincy stood up, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "What is this about?" "Harold Thornton has filed a complaint. Says you assaulted him at the Rose Garden, threatened him with a deadly weapon. He wants you arrested." "That is not what happened," Olivia said, standing up beside Quincy. "Quincy was protecting me. Thornton was the one being violent." "I am sure that is true, Miss Anderson," the sheriff said, not unkindly. "But it is your word and Mr. Walker's against a man who owns half this town. Judge Morrison is not going to side with a drifter and a former soiled dove over Harold Thornton. So what happens now?" Quincy asked, his jaw tight. "Well, I am supposed to bring you in. You would go before the judge tomorrow, and given who Thornton is, you would probably be looking at 30 days in jail and a fine you cannot afford. After that, Thornton would make sure you were run out of town if you are lucky. If you are unlucky, you might have an unfortunate accident." Quincy absorbed this information with no change in expression. He had known this was coming in some part of his mind. Men like Harold Thornton did not forget being humiliated, and they had the money and power to make trouble for anyone who crossed them. "Or," Sheriff Daniels continued, glancing at Olivia, "you could both leave town. Right now. I did not find you here. You were already gone when I came looking. You get a head start, and Thornton can complain all he wants, but there is nothing I can do if I cannot find you." "You are letting us go?" Olivia asked, surprise evident in her voice. "I am not letting you do anything because I never found you," the sheriff said firmly. "But if I had found you, I might have mentioned that I was not comfortable with how Thornton treats women. I might have said that I think you both deserve a chance at a better life. But since I did not find you, I guess I will never know." He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away before either of them could respond. Quincy and Olivia looked at each other. "I need to leave," Quincy said. "But you could stay. Mrs. Chen would keep you safe. Once I am gone, Thornton will not have any reason to bother you." "He will always have a reason," Olivia said quietly. "Men like him do not forget, and besides, I do not want to stay here without you." The words hung in the air between them, full of meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. "Olivia," Quincy started, but she cut him off. "I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other for a week, but you are the only person in 3 years who has treated me like I matter. The only person who has made me feel like I could have a future worth living. I am not asking you for anything except to let me come with you. Wherever you are going, I want to go too." Quincy wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that he was not the kind of man who could give her the life she deserved, that he was damaged and broken and better off alone. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw the same loneliness that had haunted him for years, and he could not turn her away. "All right," he said. "We leave tonight. Pack what you can carry." They told Mrs. Chen what was happening, and the older woman nodded as if she had expected this. She packed them food for the journey, bread and cheese and dried meat, and refused to take any payment. "You keep your money," she said firmly. "You need it more than me. And you take care of her," she added, fixing Quincy with a stern look. "She is a good person. She deserves good life." "I will do my best," Quincy promised. They left Telluride as the sun was setting, riding double on Quincy's horse with their few possessions tied behind the saddle. The town fell away behind them, and ahead lay nothing but open country and uncertain future. But for the first time in years, Quincy did not feel alone. They rode through the night, putting as much distance between themselves and Telluride as possible. Olivia sat in front of him, her back against his chest, and he could feel her warmth even through their clothes. They did not talk much, saving their energy for the journey, but the silence was comfortable. As dawn broke over the mountains, they stopped beside a creek to rest and water the horse. Quincy helped Olivia down, and she stretched, working the stiffness out of her back. The morning light caught in her auburn hair, turning it to flame, and Quincy found himself staring. "What?" Olivia asked, catching him looking. "Nothing," he said, turning away to tend to the horse, but it was not nothing. Somewhere in the last week, she had stopped being a responsibility and become something more. He was not ready to name it yet, but it was there, undeniable. They ate some of the bread and cheese Mrs. Chen had packed. Then Quincy laid out his bedroll for Olivia to rest on. "You should sleep for a few hours. We will move again at midday. What about you? I will keep watch. Quincy, you have not slept either. You need rest as much as I do." "I am used to it." Olivia frowned but did not argue. She lay down on the bedroll, and within minutes exhaustion claimed her. Quincy sat with his back against a tree, his rifle across his knees, and watched her sleep. Her face was peaceful, the bruise fading to yellow-green, and she looked younger, more vulnerable. He felt a fierce protectiveness rise in him, a determination to keep her safe no matter what it cost. They traveled like that for 3 days, riding through the Colorado high country, staying off the main roads and avoiding towns. Quincy was not sure where they were going, only that they needed to keep moving until he was certain they were not being followed. At night, they camped under the stars, and Quincy taught Olivia how to build a fire that would not smoke too much, how to tell which plants were safe to eat, how to read the landscape for signs of water. She was a quick learner, soaking up everything he taught her with an eagerness that made him smile. And in turn, she told him more about her life, filling in the gaps he had not known to ask about. She told him about learning to read from her mother, about the books she had loved as a child, about the dreams she had once had of becoming a teacher. "You still could," Quincy said one night as they sat by the fire. "Become a teacher, I mean, once we find a place to settle." "Do you really think so?" Olivia asked, and there was such hope in her voice that it hurt. "I do not see why not. You are smart and patient and good with words. Any school would be lucky to have you." She smiled, and it transformed her face, making her beautiful in a way that took his breath away. He looked away quickly, afraid she would see too much in his expression. On the 4th day, they reached a small settlement called Ridgeway, south of where they had started. It was barely a town, just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads, but it had a general store and a boarding house and a church. Quincy rode in cautiously, his hand near his gun, but nobody paid them much attention. They were just another pair of travelers passing through, nothing remarkable about them. They stopped at the general store to buy supplies, and while Quincy was settling the bill, Olivia struck up a conversation with the store owner's wife, a plump woman with kind eyes named Dorothy. By the time Quincy had loaded their purchases onto the horse, Olivia had learned that there was a ranch about 10 miles west that was looking for hands, and that the rancher's wife had just had a baby and could use help around the house. You know anything about ranching?" Olivia asked as they rode toward the address Dorothy had given them. "Some," Quincy said. "I have worked cattle before. It is hard work, but honest." The ranch was called the Double Bar W, and it was run by a man named Walter Werner and his wife, Sarah. They were in their 30s, weathered and practical, with the kind of no-nonsense attitude that came from years of fighting to make a living from difficult land. Walter looked Quincy up and down, taking in his worn clothes and the way he sat his horse, and seemed to approve of what he saw. "You know cattle?" Walter asked. "Yes, sir. I have worked drives from Texas to Kansas, and I have done ranch work in Wyoming and Colorado." "Can you mend fence, break horses, handle a branding iron, all of that?" Walter looked at Olivia. "And you, miss?" "My wife could use help with the house and the baby, but it is not easy work. We cannot pay much." "I am not afraid of hard work," Olivia said, lifting her chin. "And I am good with children. I would be happy to help Mrs. Werner." Walter and Sarah exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them, and then Sarah nodded. "We will give you both a trial," Walter said. "1 month. If it works out, we can talk about something more permanent. There is a line shack about a mile from the main house. It is not fancy, but it has got a roof and a stove. You two can stay there." Quincy felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. "That is more than fair. Thank you." The line shack was exactly as advertised, a small one-room cabin with a potbelly stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. It was rough and drafty and smelled of old wood smoke, but after days of sleeping on the ground, it felt like luxury. Olivia walked around the room, touching the table, the stove, the faded curtains on the single window, and when she turned to look at Quincy, she was smiling. "It is perfect," she said. "It is a shack," Quincy pointed out. "It is ours," Olivia corrected. "Or at least it is ours for now. That is more than I have had in a long time." That night they shared the small space awkwardly, both very aware of the single bed and the intimacy of the situation. Quincy offered to sleep on the floor, but Olivia refused. "The floor is cold and hard. The bed is big enough for both of us. We can be adults about this." So they lay down on opposite sides of the bed, careful not to touch, and stared at the ceiling in the darkness. Quincy was intensely aware of her breathing, the warmth of her body just inches away, the scent of her hair. He did not think he would be able to sleep, but exhaustion won out, and he drifted off to the sound of her steady breath. He woke once in the night to find that they had both moved in their sleep, and Olivia was curled against his side, her head on his shoulder. He knew he should move away, should maintain the careful distance they had been preserving, but he could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he wrapped his arm around her and let himself enjoy the simple comfort of another person's warmth. When morning came, they separated quickly, both embarrassed, but neither mentioned it. The work at the Double Bar W was hard but satisfying. Quincy spent his days mending fences, moving cattle, and helping Walter with the 100 tasks that kept a ranch running. Olivia worked in the main house with Sarah, caring for the baby, cooking, cleaning, and gradually coaxing the exhausted young mother to take breaks and rest. In the evenings, Quincy and Olivia would return to the line shack, too tired to do much more than eat a simple meal and fall into bed. But on Sundays, when the work was lighter, they would sit outside the shack and talk. Quincy found himself opening up in ways he never had before, telling Olivia about his fears and hopes, about the nightmares he still had about his brother's death, about the way he had felt so lost after his mother died. And Olivia, in turn, shared her own struggles, the shame she carried from her years in the brothel, the fear that she would never be able to leave that part of her life behind. "You are not defined by what happened to you," Quincy told her one evening as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. "You are defined by who you choose to be now." "Do you really believe that?" Olivia asked. "I am trying to," Quincy said honestly. "For both of us." She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and they sat like that in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. The month passed quickly, and at the end of it, Walter offered them permanent positions. The pay was not much, but it came with the shack and meals at the main house, and it was more stability than either of them had known in years. They accepted without hesitation. Autumn turned to winter, and the work became harder as snow blanketed the high country. But the hardship brought Quincy and Olivia closer together. They learned each other's rhythms, the small habits and preferences that made up a shared life. Quincy learned that Olivia sang quietly to herself when she was happy, that she hated coffee but loved tea, that she had a small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident with a kitchen knife. Olivia learned that Quincy was a light sleeper who often woke in the night, that he had a dry sense of humor that took her by surprise, that he was gentle with animals and children despite his hard exterior. And slowly, carefully, they fell in love. It was not a sudden thing, not a bolt of lightning or a dramatic revelation. It was more like the changing of seasons, inevitable and natural. It was in the way Quincy started bringing Olivia wildflowers when he rode the range in spring. It was in the way Olivia made sure his coffee was hot every morning, even though she did not drink it herself. It was in the way they fit together in the narrow bed, his body curved around hers, her back against his chest. But neither of them said the words. Quincy was afraid that speaking it aloud would somehow break the fragile thing they had built. And Olivia, for all her courage, could not quite believe that someone like Quincy could truly love someone with her past. It was Sarah Werner who finally pushed them to acknowledge what everyone else could already see. It was a warm day in late April, nearly a year after Quincy and Olivia had arrived at the Double Bar W. Olivia was in the kitchen helping Sarah with the bread when Sarah suddenly said, "So when are you two getting married?" Olivia almost dropped the bowl she was holding. "What? You and Quincy? When are you getting married?" "Because you are obviously in love with each other and you have been living together for almost a year, and at some point you should probably make it official." "We are not living together," Olivia protested, her face flushing. "We just share the line shack. It is not the same thing." Sarah gave her a look that clearly said she was not fooled. "Honey, I have eyes. I have seen the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him. That is not just friendship or convenience. That is love." "Even if that were true," Olivia said quietly, "why would he want to marry someone like me? Someone with my history." Sarah set down her rolling pin and came around the table to take Olivia's hands in hers. "Listen to me. Whatever happened to you before you came here, that was not your fault. You were a young woman alone in the world, doing what you had to do to survive. There is no shame in that, and Quincy knows that. He does not care about your past. He cares about you right now as you are. How can you be sure? Because I have known men like Quincy. Good men who have seen the worst of the world and somehow managed to keep their hearts intact. Those men do not waste their time on things that do not matter, and you matter to him, more than anything." Olivia felt tears welling up and she blinked them back. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I am afraid to hope for too much. Every time I have let myself hope, it has been taken away." "I know," Sarah said gently. "But you cannot live your life in fear. Sometimes you have to take a leap and trust that someone will catch you." That night, Olivia returned to the line shack to find Quincy sitting at the table, whittling. He looked up when she entered, and his face softened in the way it only did when he saw her. "Good day," he asked. "Yes," Olivia said, and then, before she could lose her courage, she added, "Quincy, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. "Why do you stay here? With me? You could go anywhere, do anything. You are not tied to this place." Quincy set down his knife and the piece of wood he had been carving. "I stay because this is where you are," he said simply. "I thought that was obvious. But why? Why me? You could find someone better, someone without my past, someone who—" "Stop," Quincy said, his voice firm. He reached across the table and took her hands in his. "There is no one better. There is just you. And I do not care about your past, Olivia. I care about who you are now and who you are becoming. I care about the way you laugh when something surprises you. I care about how kind you are to Sarah's baby, how patient you are with the horses, how you see the good in people even after everything you have been through." He took a deep breath, and Olivia could see that he was nervous, this strong, quiet man who never seemed afraid of anything. "I love you," Quincy said, the words coming out rough but certain. "I have loved you for months, probably since that day on the hillside when you cried in my arms. I did not know how to say it, or if I had the right to say it. But I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you if you will have me." Olivia felt her heart break open in the best possible way, all the fear and shame and doubt cracking apart to make room for joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to say it, afraid it could not be real. But I love you, Quincy Walker. I love you so much." He stood up and came around the table, pulling her to her feet and into his arms, and then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Olivia melted into him, her hands coming up to cup his face, and for the first time since she was 17 years old, she felt completely safe. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I do not have much to offer you except a lined shack and a cowboy's wages, but I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy." "Yes," Olivia said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course I will marry you." They were married a month later in the small church in Ridgeway, with Walter and Sarah Werner as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Olivia wore a simple white dress that Sarah had helped her make, and Quincy wore his best shirt and a new hat he had bought special for the occasion. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Quincy kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance were seen wiping their eyes. The reception was held at the church hall, with food brought by everyone in the community and music provided by a local fiddler. Quincy and Olivia danced their first dance as husband and wife, and though Quincy was not much of a dancer, he held her close and swayed to the music, and Olivia thought it was the most perfect moment of her life. As the evening wore on and the sky darkened, they slipped away from the party and rode back to the Double Bar W together. The lined shack was their home now, truly and officially, and when they stepped inside and closed the door behind them, Olivia felt a sense of belonging that she had never known before. Quincy lit the lantern and turned to her, suddenly shy. "I know this is not much of a wedding night. I wish I could give you a proper honeymoon, a fancy hotel." Olivia silenced him with a kiss. "I do not need any of that," she said softly. "I just need you." They made love for the first time that night, slow and tender and full of emotion. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Quincy's arm around her waist and Olivia's head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you happy?" Quincy asked quietly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Olivia replied. "Are you?" "Yes," Quincy said, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "More than I can say." Life at the Double Bar W settled into a comfortable routine. Quincy continued to work with the cattle and help Walter run the ranch, and Olivia continued to help Sarah with the house, and the growing number of children. Sarah had another baby the following year, and then another the year after that. But now, Olivia was not just helping with someone else's children. She and Quincy were talking about starting a family of their own. It happened in the spring of 1885, 3 years after they had first met. Olivia realized she was pregnant when her monthly courses did not come, and she started feeling queasy in the mornings. She was nervous to tell Quincy, afraid of how he might react, but when she finally worked up the courage, he lifted her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Olivia, we are going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "I am terrified," Quincy admitted. "But yes, I am happy, so incredibly happy." The pregnancy was not easy. Olivia was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down, and as she grew larger, the summer heat became oppressive. But Quincy was attentive and patient, bringing her cool water and sitting with her on the porch in the evenings when she could not sleep. Sarah gave her advice and reassurance, having been through it herself multiple times, and slowly, Olivia's fear gave way to excitement. Their son was born on a cold December night, with Sarah acting as midwife and Quincy pacing outside until Sarah finally told him to come in and meet his child. When Quincy saw Olivia holding the tiny, red-faced baby, his eyes filled with tears. "He is perfect," Quincy whispered, touching the baby's small hand with one finger. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Thomas," Olivia said, "after your brother, if that is all right with you." Quincy looked at her, his expression full of love and gratitude. "Yes," he said, "that is perfect." Thomas Walker was a healthy, happy baby who seemed to take after his father in temperament, quiet and observant, watching the world with serious gray eyes. Quincy was a devoted father, always coming home from work to hold his son, teaching him to ride before he could walk, showing him the stars and the mountains and the wide open spaces. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Rose, and then 2 years after that, another son they named James. The line shack became too small for their growing family, so Walter and Quincy built an addition, turning the one-room cabin into a proper house with 3 bedrooms and a kitchen big enough for Olivia to cook for her brood. The years passed, and Quincy and Olivia grew older, their love deepening with each season. They faced hardships: harsh winters, sick cattle, the death of Walter Werner from a sudden heart attack that left Sarah to run the ranch with Quincy's help. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quincy took Olivia back to the hillside above Mrs. Chen's old boarding house in Telluride. They had heard that Mrs. Chen had passed away peacefully in her sleep the year before, and Quincy wanted to pay his respects. They stood on the hill looking down at the town. So much had changed, and yet so much was the same. "You ever regret it?" Olivia asked, slipping her hand into his. "Stopping that day?" "Getting involved?" Quincy looked at her, at the woman she had become, strong and confident and radiantly happy. He thought about their children waiting for them back at the ranch, about the life they had built together from nothing but hope and determination. "Not for a single second," he said. "Saving you was the best thing I ever did. It saved me too." "I love you," Olivia said, the words still as powerful as the first time she had spoken them. "I love you too," Quincy replied. "Always." They stood there as the sun set over the mountains. 2 people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and had chosen to build a life filled with light. And as they walked back down the hill hand in hand, Quincy thought about that day so long ago when he had heard a woman scream and had made the choice to help her. It had been the easiest and the hardest decision of his life, and he would make it again in a heartbeat. The years continued to unfold with a gentle rhythm that Quincy had never imagined possible during his lonely, wandering days. By 1892, Thomas was 7 years old and already showing promise as a horseman, just like his mother had predicted. He had Quincy's quiet nature but Olivia's quick smile, and he loved nothing more than riding out with his father to check the fence lines, asking endless questions about the cattle and the land. Rose, at 5, was a whirlwind of energy with auburn hair exactly like her mother's, and a stubborn streak that both delighted and exhausted her parents. She followed Olivia everywhere, insisting on helping with the cooking and the garden, and already had the entire Werner family wrapped around her little finger. James, the baby at 3 years old, was the most affectionate of the three, always climbing into someone's lap for cuddles and declaring his love for everyone from his siblings to the ranch dogs to the chickens in the yard. The double bar W had prospered under the partnership between Quincy and Sarah Werner. After Walter's death, Sarah had officially made Quincy her partner in the ranch, recognizing that without his hard work and dedication, she would have lost everything. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and friendship, and it worked well. Sarah's oldest son, now 14, was learning the business alongside Thomas, and there was talk of him eventually taking over his father's role. Olivia had also found her calling. She had started teaching the children on the ranch and the neighboring homesteads, holding classes in the Werners' large kitchen 3 days a week. It was not the formal schoolhouse she had once dreamed of, but it was teaching nonetheless, and she loved it. She watched children learn to read and write and figure sums, and she saw in their eyes the same hunger for knowledge that she had once felt as a girl in Missouri. On a warm summer evening in June, Quincy and Olivia sat on the porch of their house, watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was teaching Rose how to rope a fence post while James toddled after them, getting in the way and laughing when he fell down. "You ever think about that day?" Olivia asked, not needing to specify which day she meant. "When you pulled me out of the rose garden." "Sometimes," Quincy admitted. "Not as often as I used to. Why do you ask?" "I was thinking about it today," Olivia said. "One of the girls in my class asked me where I came from, and I told her Missouri, but then I started thinking about all the places I have been, all the things that have happened to bring me here. And I realized that if even one thing had been different, if my parents had not died, if I had not gone to Denver, if you had not been riding through Telluride that particular day, none of this would exist. Thomas and Rose and James would not exist." She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. Quincy noticed the gesture and felt his heart skip a beat. "Olivia," he said carefully, "is there something you need to tell me?" She looked at him, and a slow smile spread across her face. "I was going to wait until I was sure, but yes. I think there is going to be a 4th child joining the Walker family sometime around Christmas." Quincy let out a whoop of joy that startled the children and made them come running. "What is it, Papa?" Thomas asked. "What happened?" "Your mother and I have some wonderful news," Quincy said, pulling Olivia close. "You are going to have a new brother or sister." Rose clapped her hands in delight. "I hope it is a sister. I want a sister to play with." "I want a brother," Thomas countered. "Then we will be even." "Baby," James declared, not entirely sure what was happening but excited nonetheless. That night, after the children were in bed, Quincy and Olivia lay together in the darkness, talking about names and making plans for where the new baby would sleep. The house that had once seemed so spacious was now quite full, and they would need to make some adjustments. "We could add another room," Quincy mused. "Maybe extend the back wall. Or we could finally build that separate house you keep talking about," Olivia suggested. The children are getting older, they need more space, and if we build something bigger, we would have room for however many more children God sees fit to bless us with. However many more, Quincy said, amusement in his voice. How many are you planning on? I do not know, Olivia said honestly. But I never thought I would have any, and now I cannot imagine life without them. So I suppose we will just see what happens. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Olivia was more tired this time than she had been with the previous 3. She was, after all, 31 years old now, not the young woman she had been when Thomas was born. But she was healthy and strong, and Sarah assured her that everything was progressing normally. Quincy threw himself into building the new house with an energy that surprised everyone. He spent every spare moment cutting timber and laying foundation stones, determined to have the structure finished before winter set in. Walter's son helped, along with some of the hands from neighboring ranches, and by October, the frame was up and the roof was on. It was a beautiful house, larger than anything they needed but built with love and care. It had 4 bedrooms upstairs and a large common room downstairs with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the valley. There was a separate kitchen with a proper stove and a pantry, and even a small room that Olivia claimed immediately as her library, though they only owned about 20 books. They moved in just before the first snow, and Olivia walked through the empty rooms with tears in her eyes. "What is wrong?" Quincy asked, concerned. "Do you not like it?" "I love it," Olivia said. "I am crying because I am happy. Because 10 years ago I was living in a brothel, convinced that I would never have anything good in my life. And now I have this beautiful house and 3 wonderful children and another on the way, and I have you. Sometimes it all feels too good to be true." Quincy pulled her into his arms, careful of her swollen belly. "It is true," he said firmly. "This is real. We built this together, and no one can take it away from us." Their 4th child, a daughter they named Clara, was born on December 20th in the new house, with Sarah once again serving as midwife. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Quincy feared for both Olivia and the baby. But Olivia was strong, and when Clara finally came into the world with a lusty cry, both mother and daughter were healthy. Rose was thrilled to finally have a sister, and she took her role as big sister very seriously, always wanting to help with the baby. Thomas and James were less interested in the new arrival, but they were gentle with her when they did pay attention, and Quincy could see that they would be protective older brothers. The winter of 1892 was harsh, with heavy snows that isolated them for weeks at a time. But the new house was warm and well built, and they had plenty of supplies laid in. Quincy spent the long evenings teaching Thomas to read from the newspapers that Sarah saved for them, while Olivia nursed Clara and helped Rose with her letters. James, too young for formal lessons, played with carved wooden animals that Quincy had made. It was during one of those long winter nights, with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, that Quincy looked around at his family and felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was everything he had never known he wanted. This was home. Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it came new challenges. The ranch had suffered some losses over the winter cattle that had frozen or starved despite their best efforts, and there was much work to be done to repair fences and buildings damaged by the heavy snow. But there were also moments of joy. Thomas caught his first fish in the creek that ran through the property. Rose learned to ride by herself, no longer needing someone to lead her horse. James said his first full sentence, and Clara smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face. By summer, life had settled into a new routine that accommodated 4 children. Olivia had to take a break from her teaching, at least until Clara was a bit older, but she did not mind. She loved being home with her children, watching them grow and learn and become their own people. One evening in July, as Quincy was coming in from the fields, he saw a rider approaching the house. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Old habits died hard, but he relaxed when he recognized Sheriff Daniels from Telluride, now considerably grayer than the last time Quincy had seen him. "Sheriff," Quincy said, surprised. "What brings you all the way out here?" Sheriff Daniels dismounted stiffly, his joints clearly bothering him. "I am not sheriff anymore," he said. "Retired last year, but I had some news I thought you might want to hear, so I rode out." Quincy invited him in, and Olivia made coffee while the children stared at the stranger with wide eyes. Once they were settled at the table, Sheriff Daniels got to the point. "Harold Thornton died last month," he said without preamble. "Heart attack. He was 63. Quincy absorbed this information without much reaction. He had not thought about Harold Thornton in years, though he supposed in the back of his mind there had always been a small worry that the man might someday track them down and cause trouble. "I thought you should know," Sheriff Daniels continued, "because there was some talk after he died. Seems he had been keeping a book, a ledger of sorts, where he wrote down the names of everyone he felt had wronged him. You were in that book, Mr. Walker. Along with a note that he had sent men after you back in '82, but they never found you." "He sent men after us," Olivia said, her hand going to her throat. "He did," the sheriff confirmed. "But like I said, they never found you. You two did a good job of disappearing. Anyway, I am here to tell you that threat is over now. Thornton is dead, and his sons have no interest in pursuing his vendettas. You are safe." Quincy reached across the table and took Olivia's hand. "Thank you for letting us know. Would you like to stay for supper? We have plenty." Sheriff Daniels smiled. "I would like that very much." Over dinner, they caught up on news from Telluride. The Rose Garden had closed down 5 years ago, the sheriff told them, after Martha, who ran it, had been arrested for theft. Many of the women who had worked there had scattered, some finding husbands, others moving to different towns to start over. Mrs. Chen's boarding house had been sold after her death and was now a family home. "Telluride is changing," the sheriff said. "It is becoming more civilized, I suppose you would say. There is talk of running electricity to the town, and they are building a new school." After dinner, as the sheriff prepared to leave, he pulled Quincy aside. "I am glad to see you made a good life for yourself, Mr. Walker. And you, Miss Anderson, or Mrs. Walker, I should say. You both deserved a second chance. Thank you," Quincy said, shaking his hand, "for everything you did for us back then." The sheriff nodded and rode off into the gathering dusk. That night, as Quincy and Olivia got ready for bed, Olivia said quietly, "I did not realize he had sent men after us. We could have been killed." "But we were not," Quincy said. "We got away and we built this life. That is what matters." "Do you ever wonder how things would have turned out if you had not stopped that day?" Olivia asked. "If you had just kept riding," Quincy pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I try not to think about that," he said. "Because a world where I did not stop is a world where I do not have you or Thomas or Rose or James or Clara. And I cannot imagine that world. I do not want to imagine it." "Neither can I," Olivia whispered. The years rolled on, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. Sarah Werner remarried in 1895 to a widower from Ridgeway, and her oldest son took over full management of the ranch, with Quincy staying on as foreman. Thomas, at 12, was already helping with the cattle, proving himself to be a natural rancher. Rose, at 10, was teaching James and Clara their letters, displaying a patience and skill that suggested she might follow in her mother's footsteps as a teacher. In 1897, Olivia gave birth to their fifth and final child, another son they named Peter. She was 36 by then, and the pregnancy was difficult, the labor even more so. Afterward, the doctor warned that another pregnancy could be dangerous, and Quincy made sure there would not be another. He loved his children, but he loved Olivia more, and he would not risk losing her. Peter was a quiet baby, content to observe the chaos of his older siblings with calm interest. He had Quincy's gray eyes and Olivia's gentle nature, and from the moment he was born, Quincy knew this child was special. As the 19th century drew to a close and the new one began, Quincy and Olivia watched their children grow and change. Thomas, at 18, was courting a girl from Ridgeway, a smart, pretty young woman who reminded Quincy a bit of Olivia at that age. Rose, at 16, had announced her intention to become a teacher and was studying everything she could get her hands on. James, at 14, was still trying to figure out who he wanted to be, alternating between wanting to be a rancher like his father and wanting to see the world beyond Colorado. Clara, at 9, was the most adventurous of the lot, always climbing trees and getting into scrapes. And Peter, at 4, was the baby who seemed wise beyond his years. In the spring of 1901, Thomas married his sweetheart in the same church where Quincy and Olivia had been married 19 years earlier. Quincy stood beside his son, so proud he thought his heart might burst, and when he looked over at Olivia in the front pew, he saw tears streaming down her face. After the ceremony, as they danced at the reception, Quincy held Olivia close and said, "Our baby is all grown up." "We still have 4 more, Olivia pointed out, but her voice was thick with emotion. "True, but he was our first, the one who made us parents. That will always be special." "Do you think we did all right by him?" Olivia asked. "By all of them." Quincy looked around the room at their children. Thomas, laughing with his new bride. Rose, deep in conversation with an older woman about the new school being built in Ridgeway. James, dancing with Clara and making her giggle. Peter, sitting with Sarah and methodically eating a piece of cake. "I think we did better than all right," Quincy said. "I think we did pretty well." In 1905, Rose left home to attend a teacher's college in Denver, the first member of either family to pursue higher education. It was Olivia's dream come true, watching her daughter do what she herself had never had the chance to do. They saw Rose off at the train station, and Olivia cried the whole way home. "She will be back," Quincy assured her. "She is just following her dreams. You taught her to do that." "I know," Olivia said. "I am just going to miss her so much." James left the following year to work on a ranch in Wyoming, wanting to see something beyond Colorado. Clara, at 14, declared her intention to never marry and instead become a rancher like her father, which made Quincy laugh and Olivia worry about her daughter's unconventional ambitions. Peter, at 9, was still at home, and he showed no signs of wanting to leave. He loved the ranch, loved the mountains, loved the life that his parents had built. Quincy sometimes worried that Peter felt obligated to stay because he was the youngest, but the boy seemed genuinely content. In 1907, Thomas and his wife gave Quincy and Olivia their first grandchild, a boy they named Quincy Jr. Holding his grandson for the first time, Quincy felt the circle complete somehow. He was 54 years old, his hair more gray than brown now, his hands rough and scarred from decades of hard work. But when he looked down at the tiny face of his grandson, he felt young again. "We are grandparents," he said to Olivia that night, still marveling at it. "We are," Olivia agreed. She was 46, with silver threads in her auburn hair and lines around her eyes from years of smiling. But to Quincy, she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her, maybe more so because now he knew every facet of her soul. "Thank you," Quincy said suddenly. "For what?" "For saying yes when I asked you to marry me, for building this life with me, for giving me a family when I never thought I would have one, for everything." Olivia smiled and kissed him softly. "Thank you for stopping that day, for seeing me when no one else did, for loving me even though you had every reason not to, for giving me a life worth living." They sat together in the darkness, holding hands the way they had on that hillside so many years ago, and Quincy thought about the path that had brought them here. It had not been easy. There had been hardship and pain and moments when he had not been sure they would make it. But they had persevered together, and now they had this beautiful, messy, wonderful life filled with children and grandchildren and love. In 1910, Rose came home from Denver with a degree in education and a husband, a fellow teacher who was kind and gentle and clearly adored her. She took a position at the new school in Ridgeway, and Olivia finally got to see her daughter achieve the dream she herself had once had. James also came home, bringing with him a wife from Wyoming and announcing that he had bought a small parcel of land not far from the Double Bar W and intended to start his own ranch. Quincy helped him build his house, and on the day James moved in, Quincy felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and sadness. His children were all grown now, all making their own way in the world. Clara, true to her word, never married. She became the best hand on the Double Bar W, able to outride and outrope most of the men, and she eventually took over as foreman when Quincy decided to slow down. She was happy in her unconventional life, and Quincy and Olivia learned to accept that happiness came in many forms, not just the one they had found. Peter, at 16, was still at home, still content. He helped his father with the lighter work now that Quincy was in his 60s, and he seemed to have no desire to leave. He was courting a girl from town, but even when they married, he built a house on the ranch property, never wanting to be far from his parents. By 1915, Quincy and Olivia had 7 grandchildren, with more on the way. They had lived through so much the turn of a new century, the changing of the Old West into something more modern and settled, the loss of friends and the joy of new life. They had watched their children grow and thrive, had seen the life they built together bear fruit in ways they never could have imagined. On their 33rd wedding anniversary, Quincy took Olivia back to Telluride one last time. The town had changed dramatically. Electricity lit the streets. Automobiles competed with horses on the roads, and the rough mining camp they had known had become a proper town with paved streets and Victorian houses. They visited the cemetery where Mrs. Chen was buried and laid flowers on her grave. They stood outside the building that had once been the Rose Garden, now converted into apartments. And they climbed the hillside one more time, moving slowly now because their joints ached and their breath came harder at altitude. At the top, they sat on a fallen log and looked down at the town spread below them. "It all started here," Olivia said softly. 33 years ago, you changed my life in this place." "We changed each other's lives," Quincy corrected. "I was lost before I met you. You gave me purpose. You gave me hope. You gave me love. And you gave me freedom," Olivia said. "Not just from that place, but from the belief that I was not worthy of love or happiness. You showed me that I deserved a good life." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun move across the sky, and Quincy thought about all the moments that had led them to this one. The scream that had changed everything. The question she had asked him why, and the answer that had broken her heart open. The slow, careful building of trust and friendship and eventually love. The years of joy and struggle and triumph. "If you could go back," Quincy said, "and change anything, would you?" Olivia did not hesitate. Not a single thing. Every moment, good and bad, led us here. And here is exactly where I want to be. Me too, Quincy said, taking her hand. Me too. They stayed on the hillside until the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold and pink. Then they walked slowly back down to where their son Peter was waiting with the wagon to take them home. Home. It was a word that meant so much more to Quincy now than it ever had before. It was not just a place or a building. It was Olivia, and it was their children, and it was the life they had built together from nothing but hope and determination and love. As they rode back toward the ranch in the gathering dusk, Olivia leaned against Quincy's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Ahead of them, the mountains stood dark against the fading light, eternal and unchanging. And behind them, Telluride faded into the distance, a ghost of the past that had given them their future. The years were kind to Quincy and Olivia Walker. They lived to see their grandchildren grow and have children of their own, creating a legacy that stretched across generations. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by a family so large they could barely fit everyone into the house that Quincy had built with his own hands. Quincy died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1928 at the age of 75, with Olivia beside him as she had been for 46 years. His last words were, "I love you," and Olivia held his hand and told him she loved him too, had always loved him, would always love him. Olivia lived for more years, long enough to see the world change in ways she never could have imagined. But she never remarried, never even considered it. She had had her great love, and that was enough for one lifetime. She spent her final years surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling stories about the old days and the cowboy who had saved her life by giving her a reason to live. She died in the spring of 1932, at the age of 71, in the house that Quincy had built. Her last coherent words were about him, about the day they met, about the love that had sustained her through everything. They were buried side by side in the cemetery in Ridgeway, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the dates of their births and deaths. But their real monument was the family they had created, the descendants who carried their blood and their values and their love forward into the future. And if you asked any of those descendants about their great-great-grandparents, they would tell you the story of how a lonely cowboy had rescued a woman from a brothel, how she had asked him why, and how his answer an honest, heartfelt admission of pain and hope, and the need to save someone even if he could not save the one who mattered most had broken her heart open and allowed love to flood in. They would tell you about the life that followed, about the 5 children and the countless grandchildren, about the ranch that still stood, and the love that had never faded. They would tell you that Quincy and Olivia Walker were proof that it was never too late for a second chance, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was to let someone in. And they would tell you that on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the valley and the stars were bright overhead, you could almost feel the presence of those 2 souls, still together, still in love, still home.